I'm Angela Greiling Keane. I'm this year's National Press Club president, and I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News. We are excited to have such a full room tonight and such a great program up ahead of us. Tonight we're going to celebrate the centennial of the suffragists marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, very, very near to here. Because we're here at the National Press Club, we will also talk about the role that the press played in helping women get the right to vote, especially through the coverage of that march 100 years ago this weekend. We're going to see a video produced by the National Women's History Museum of some of the women who worked more than a century ago to get women the right to vote. It was a long effort, as I think most of us in this room know. But to kick things off before that, I'm going to propose a toast. Hopefully you all got a glass on the way in. I'd like to propose a toast to the courageous women suffragists who put themselves on the line to gain something that most of us today take for granted. Please raise your glasses to them.
The foundation of our democracy is rooted in the right of all of its citizens to express their opinions and influence government through their vote. Today, Americans are bonded by our ability to vote, but for many groups, the fight to secure full citizenship has been a long and arduous one. American women's fight for suffrage was the making of over 70 years of hard work, dedication, organization, failures, and ultimate success. It culminated in the passage of the 19th Amendment that enfranchised women on August 26, 1920. Our foremothers' battle for the vote began in 1848. In the earliest stages of the movement, many women, disheartened and outraged by the practice of slavery, had joined the effort to abolish it. But like outspoken abolitionists Sarah and Angelina Grimke, these women became disillusioned when they discovered that they were barred from leadership positions in American political culture because of their gender. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, two linchpins in the development of the movement, attended the 1840 Anti-Slavery Convention in London, and Mott and 5 other official delegates were refused seats on the basis of their gender, Stanton and Mott decided to hold their own convention 8 years later in Seneca Falls, New York. The convention marked the first public proclamation of American women's demand for the right to vote. The Declaration of Sentiments, as it was called, also endorsed a variety of other changes. It was signed by 68 women and 32 men. Between 1848 and 1869, about 20 other women's rights conventions were held in the United States, which became the basis for the suffrage movement in the 1870s and 80s. After the end of the Civil War in 1865, a rift developed within the movement over the 15th Amendment, which granted the vote to African American men, but made no reference to women. The National Woman Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, opposed black male suffrage without suffrage for women, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe, supported the enfranchisement of African American men as a first step towards the enfranchisement of women. Although the next 20 years proved divisive for the two organizations, in 1890 they reconciled and merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. In the early 1890s, Carrie Chapman Catt led the organization in helping Western women win the vote, and the Wyoming Territory became the first to grant full civil rights to women on December 10, 1869. This state strategy was amplified in 1916 by revived attention to an amendment to the Constitution, which would make woman suffrage a federal right. Led by Maud Wood Park and the National American Woman Suffrage Association's office in D.C., the movement generated a radical new party called the National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. The party vigorously picketed the White House in 1917, demanding the enactment of the constitutional amendment. Both the House and the Senate voted to approve the 19th Amendment by the necessary two-thirds majority in 1919. Tennessee was the last state to approve the amendment by one vote, and the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution on August 26, 1920. After more than 7 decades of labor, American women won the vote in every part of the United States.
Here at the National Press Club, while it's no longer remarkable for a woman to be standing here as the National Press Club president, there was a time not so long ago that it was almost unimaginable. You can learn more about the history about women at the National Press Club in the display that's in the lobby. It went up today and it'll be here for March for Women's History Month. Today we have women leaders across the landscape in journalism, from anchors like Diane Sawyer to New York Times executive editor Jill Abramson to the Gannett CEO Gracia Martori. At my Bloomberg bureau, we have Cheska Antonelli as our first female Washington bureau chief. At the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, there are 20 women senators, the most that that chamber has ever included. In these ways, we have arrived, but the future is still before us. Most of these people are the first woman to hold their position. The Women's Media Center, in a report issued last week, found that male front-page bylines at the top U.S. newspapers outnumbered female bylines in coverage of the 2012 presidential election by a margin of nearly 3-to-1. Men were also far more likely to be quoted than women in newspapers, television, and on public radio. On Sunday talk shows, women comprise only 14% of those interviewed and 29% of roundtable guests. Here at the National Press Club, I'm the 106th president overall and the 11th woman. But in good news, I took the reins from another woman, Teresa Werner, who was president last year, and including the two of us, 6 of the past 11 presidents, so more than 50%, have been women. So we're making up for lost time here. Some of our club member predecessors, including some women who are here with us tonight, fought long and hard for women to gain admittance to the National Press Club, which they finally did get in 1971. Let's listen now to the words of one of those first female members, Liz Carpenter.
It was a great thrill for me the first time I went to Washington, which some people had irreverently called the only asylum in the world run by its own inmates, and I found that to be pretty true lots of times. But I was thrilled to be there. I was 22 years old, fresh out of the University of Texas with my journalism degree in hand, and I took the 12th floor where all the important newspapers were housed and started knocking on doors and finding that the New York Herald Tribune with Bert Andrews, the Christian Science Monitor with Roscoe Drummond, all of these were the papers we'd been studying in history of journalism back in Texas. That led up to my seeing for the first time the National Press Club, and I'd never seen a real club before. I was out of Texas in a small town, and I remember those paneled walls, dark brown, and 3 tickers, INS, AP, and UP, going off all the time. The click of them, if you're a reporter, that gets in your blood fast, and it never leaves. Eleanor Roosevelt was the mentor of all newswomen, and for good reason, because she started the first press conferences that a First Lady ever held. And incidentally, Lady Bird Johnson was the first Lady to have a journalism degree. And so she knew the 5 W's and the H, and she knew, made my job as her press secretary much later easy. But Eleanor was interested in social issues, and it was the Depression. As a result of Eleanor, who only allowed women, she wiped out discrimination by discriminating and allowing only women. So it meant that all of those big services that had ignored women or throttled them had to hire somebody to cover real news, because Eleanor was news. The press club was the place to be, and it was a place that you always loved to take guests when we finally had the opportunity to. And since then, it's very equal. Several women have been president of the press club. I've made 2 speeches there. It's just a place that is so exciting that I don't even know that there's much of a Women's National Press Club left anymore, because that's what happens with equality.
Liz, who unfortunately passed away 3 years ago at the age of 89, had, of course, a distinguished career in journalism and as a spokeswoman for Lady Bird Johnson. Here tonight with us, we have Vivian Valberg, who in 1982 was the first woman to be the National Press Club president. We also have Peggy Simpson, who was president of the Washington Press Club before its merger with the National Press Club. Tonight we will hear from experts about the beginning of the social change that led to women achieving a measure of equality in society. We know of the struggles and the successes of this and other social movements largely through press accounts. A free and unfettered press can be the eyes and the ears of the world, and that helps us function in a sound and breathing democracy. You are here tonight visiting the world's leading professional organization for journalists. What we can achieve in journalism is, and always has been, linked with what we can achieve in society. We journalists are the storytellers and the writers writing the first draft of history. Tonight, we will hear some amazing stories. But before we listen to our experts, let's watch one more video about the role of the press during the suffrage march in 1913.
At 3:20 p.m. on Monday, March 3, 1913, 5,000 marchers, who had descended on Washington, D.C. in a public testament to their determination for securing the vote for American women, began their march down Pennsylvania Avenue. Their destination? The White House. In the lead was lawyer and outspoken suffragist Inez Milholland, dressed in a long flowing white cape and sitting atop her horse, Grey Dawn. Alice Paul, future leader of the radical National Woman's Party, had begun to plan the landmark parade less than 3 months before, and had used her marketing genius to coincide the parade with the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson the next day, knowing there would be thousands of people in Washington to witness the suffrage cause. The marchers included women from countries that had enfranchised women, as well as nurses, women farmers, homemakers, doctors, actresses, librarians, and students, interspersed with 4 mounted brigades, 3 heralds, 24 floats, and 9 bands. Thanks to Paul, who had provided the press with daily bulletins for weeks in advance, the parade had drawn a record crowd of some 500,000 onlookers. The extravaganza moved effortlessly along for the first few blocks, but the peaceful assembly would soon erupt in violence, as many of the men, who had been drinking, broke through steel cables and spilled into the path of the parade. Women were jeered, tripped, shoved, injured, spat at, and assaulted with verbal epithets and threats. The police did little to control the crowd and protect the marchers. One account describes an officer spitting on a woman, and a policeman who watched the riots remarked, "They should have stayed where they belonged." By the end of the spectacle, 100 marchers were taken to the local emergency hospital. The parade caught the attention of the national press, which had turned out in force to cover the events. Prior to the march's commencement, the Washington Post commented that their character, ability, and common sense forced serious recognition of the women's demand. In her March 3rd column in the New York Evening Journal, muckraking journalist Nellie Bly declared that suffragists are men's superiors. Readers across the country who hadn't known much about the movement or had only a marginal interest were suddenly galvanized by the press's descriptions of the violence that broke out at the parade. The Associated Press reported 5,000 women marching in the women's suffrage pageant today virtually fought their way foot by foot up Pennsylvania Avenue through a surging mob that completely defied the Washington police, swamped the marchers, and broke their procession into little companies. In the weeks that followed, congressional hearings were held on the abuse of the marchers, and the press turned out in force to cover them. The San Francisco Examiner noted, "The suffragettes have gained thousands of supporters in places where they had not looked for converts." The reaction to the violence at the march also won the suffragists the support of the New York Times, even though it was staunchly against suffrage. Whatever one may think of the object for which the women were marching, what they did was in the exercise of the right of the legality and legitimacy of which, as an expression of sentiment and desire, are beyond question, the Times stated. Like other American citizens, they were entitled to protection. The Times' recognition of their constitutional right of assembly gave a greater credence to their right to vote. As a further result of the press's coverage, newspapers became the forum for a broader conversation about women's place in society and public life. While the media's reporting on the women's rights movement still had far to go, its coverage of the 1913 suffrage parade stands out as an admirable effort of reporting on women's campaign for equality.
Well, the Press Club is proud to host this event tonight in partnership with the National Women's History Museum. There are a lot of groups who have come together to help make it happen. I'd like to recognize them. Please hold your applause until I get to the end of the list, because fortunately it's a long list. And I'm going to ask representatives of each to stand as I say your group's name. We have the Accounting and Financial Women's Alliance, the American Association of University Women, the Association of Junior Leagues International, the Business and Professional Women's Foundation, Daughters of the American Revolution, General Federation of Women's Clubs International, Girls Learn International, the League of Women Voters, the National Association of Women Judges, the National Conference of Puerto Rican Women, the National Congress of Black Women, the National Federation of Press Women, the National Foundation for Women Legislators, the National League of American Pen Women, the National Women's History Project, the Older Women's League, or OWL, the Sewell Belmont House and Museum, Women in Aerospace, Women in Defense, Women in Film and Video, Women in Military Service for America, Women in Business Enterprise National Council, the Council on Women Leaders, the Women's National Democratic Club, and last but certainly not least, the Muslim Women's Council. Now let's give them all a round of applause. Now, I would like to present April Ryan, who is the White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Networks. April has covered 3 White Houses, and I will turn over the podium to her. Good places.
Good evening, everyone. You can do better than that. This is Women's History Month and yes. It is great to be here with you this evening. Well, we're still a little bit in February, the Black History Month, but we're moving into a Women's History Month. And I am really pleased to be here. For one, I stand on the shoulders of so many great women. One thing my mother told me before I got married, she said, honey, it's gonna all fall on you. I said, that's not fair, that's not fair. She said, but it's gonna happen. So I learned from that women are the ones who are moving everything. We're not just the neck, we are the shoulders, we are the head. And isn't it true? So once the rest of the world understands that, I think they've got it right, you know? But I am here to set the scene about journalism and women in journalism, particularly in this town. I work with so many great women, to include a young lady standing in the back, Enid Doggett, and I also want to pay homage to one of my dear friends who happened to be a woman that I looked up to and still look up to, my college professor, Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, who you will hear from this evening. Great, great woman. Setting the scene here in Washington, I arrived in Washington 16 years ago, the second term of William Jefferson Clinton. Covered 3 presidents, and it's not easy for a young woman in Washington. Nancy Pelosi has it right. It's not a glass ceiling. Glass, I took a look at the synopsis. Glass you can easily shatter. A marble ceiling. Oh, you know, I was told early on, men in this town talk to men. And that is still the case 16 years later. So that makes it doubly, triply, quadruply as hard for women to be able to move forward in this town. One thing that you will find, and from history's sake, from the suffrage movement to the civil rights movement to many movements in this country, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. You continue to squeak, we listen, we journalists come to you, and then what we do is hear your squeak, and we present it to the leader of the free world, who happens to be a man at this point. And we present that to him. And you know, it's interesting for people to really pay attention to you, be it journalists, be it newsmakers, be it what have you. You have to present your facts. You have to be part of the inside the Beltway crew of sorts. And sometimes it's best that you're not. And I think many women like Eleanor Clift, many women in this town like Dr. Martha Joint Kumar, who's a statistician, who the White Houses that she's been embedded with, I guess you would say, not embedded, but covering with stats. She has gained the confidence of that administration, of each administration, to be able to give a give and take, to find out what's going on, and they rely on her as well. You know, there's so many women who have pioneered in this town. I remember a story from one of the pioneers back in the Kennedy era. And this is how things have changed, but yet still stay the same. We have a lot of women in power, but still not at the highest point of power. And when President Kennedy was president, the White House Correspondents Association was very active. I am actually a board member on the White House Correspondents Association, and it's 99 years old now. But back then, when President Kennedy was president, women were not allowed to attend the dinners. And you know those dinners now. Everyone comes. All the celebrities, the presidents. Jokes are made. Donald Trump came. They talked about his hair. But it's interesting, that famous dinner did not allow women. President Kennedy was petitioned. And they said, please do not go to that dinner because women are not allowed. And because he saw that that wasn't right, and that dinner, and to be a member of that association was only 25 cents at that time, women were not allowed. He said that he was not going to go to the dinner until women were allowed to come in. Now, yes. Now women are allowed, and we sit on the board of the association. We help steer the association. But going back from President Kennedy now to President Barack Obama, and looking what's happening down the road on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue, we still have a long way to go. For example, today, there was a celebration about a certain act that was passed. What was that act? Violence Against Women Act, that's right. How many years ago was it enacted into law when women were allowed or made, it was made law that women are supposed to make equal pay, the same amount as a man? We are still struggling. We are still struggling in the press to be able to go on that yacht with the senator to talk to them about their whatever they're doing, like our male counterparts. The struggle still continues. But it's not about gender, it's just about we do the same thing you do. So why won't you let us in? The struggle still continues here in Washington for the press, but I want you to know that I'm fighting with you. Thank you so much. And now we will hear from the great Eleanor Clift.
We're still waiting on Maureen Bunyan, who had a job to do. She had to anchor a newscast, so she will be joining us when she gets here. So in the meantime, I am going to turn the microphone over to Eleanor Clift, who is going to moderate the panel of wonderful women leaders we have tonight. Eleanor and the panelists, why don't you come on up here to the stage. Eleanor is a contributing editor for Newsweek magazine and also for the Daily Beast. You've probably also seen her on the McLaughlin Group, and pertinent to tonight, she is the author of Founding Sisters and the 19th Amendment. I'll let you introduce the panel.
Okay. Well, welcome, and we're all here tonight to commemorate the 100th anniversary of this remarkable march that is seen as kind of the official kickoff of the suffrage movement, although actually it began in 1872, but we won't mention those ensuing decades. But tonight we're focusing on the march and the legacy of that event and how it played out in the media then and how we see the roots of some of that coverage in media today. I have to point out that women were not allowed in the press club, this august place where we are, until 1971. And women were allowed to sit up in the balcony, and of course that spawned a book called Girls in the Balcony. So one thing we women know how to do is we know how to make chicken soup out of chicken something else. We have three scholars here with us tonight. I'm going to say briefly who each of them are and then introduce them a little more fully when they make their presentation. To my immediate left is Dr. Jill Zonheiser. She is the co-author of a book called Alice Paul, The Making of a Political Leader. And in the middle, we have Erica Falk with the Aspen Institute, and she's the author of Women for President, Media Bias in 9 Campaigns, going back to 1872 and then on up through Hillary Clinton. And on my far left is April Ryan's professor. April, you did a great job with April. And it's Dr. Rosalind Turbock Penn, author of the book African American Women in the Struggle for the Vote, 1850 to 1920. So we're going to start with Jill. And Jill has really looked into the life and the career of Alice Paul. And Alice Paul was the inspirational leader of the march. And she came up with the idea, she orchestrated it, and when it turned violent, she didn't sit in despair. She saw that she had won the sympathy of a nation, and she knew how to take advantage of that sympathy. And later, when women were jailed and beaten and passed out little notes out to the public, she turned them into press releases. So I regard her as sort of the first marketing genius of the women's suffrage movement. So Jill, have at it.
Good evening, everyone. Glad to be here. Glad you're all here. Well, Eleanor and even some of the earlier speakers and the video that we saw really encapsulated why we're talking about the 1913 suffrage procession, as Alice Paul liked to talk about it, rather than a parade. But why we're still talking about a parade or a procession 100 years later. And that was because of all the publicity that attended the parade, what happened during the parade and the congressional hearing which followed the parade, as you got a glimpse of in that second video. The 1913 procession was really the opening act towards the turn that your first video on the suffrage movement talked about, towards seeking the constitutional amendment. This drive had been sort of backburnered for quite a while because of fears that Southern Democrats in the Southern states would never vote to enfranchise black women in the South for fear of upsetting the racial politics of the South. So Alice Paul decided that actually the federal amendment was the easiest way to go. She thought, I think, that the Southern states would be a little more willing than perhaps they were ultimately. But she, long story short, she decides to stage a wonderful parade of the type that she had participated in Britain, along with her colleague from Britain, a woman named Lucy Burns. And the parade was really the opening act towards this turn towards the federal amendment. And Alice Paul, I think, pretty universally is given credit for turning the American suffrage movement towards the federal amendment. And we have only 7 years between 1913 and 1920 until the 19th Amendment is finally passed. So Alice Paul, with her marketing genius, her genius for getting press and publicity, and like many people today, she didn't believe that there wasn't any such, she did believe there wasn't any such thing as bad publicity. She was okay with that. But she really vaulted suffrage from an issue that really wasn't even considered very seriously on part of the press, to an issue of national prominence. And it stayed that way pretty much the entire time for the 7 years. We think, oh, another march on Washington, what's the big deal? But actually, this was only the second political demonstration that had been done in Washington by 1913. The first one, does anyone know what the first one was? Coxey's Army came to town in 1896 in the wake of an economic depression, seeking for some social programs for the unemployed. He was so successful that as he was reading a proclamation, what the kinds of things that the unemployed wanted on the steps of the Capitol police came and arrested him, along with some of his other people. So we could say that the 1913 procession was the first successful political demonstration. And of course, it really inaugurated a series of, up until the present time, of people seeing Washington as a site for political protest and particularly for civil rights protests. So we remember it for that reason. It validated particularly Pennsylvania Avenue as a place for that. Alice Paul wanted to stage women's exclusion, and this is why it wasn't okay for her to have a suffrage contingent in the inaugural day parade. That was the original idea that the National Suffrage Organization had, but she really wanted something separate, something that would be, as she said, a procession of our own, to stage the fact that women were excluded from political power. And where does she want to march? She wants to march down Pennsylvania Avenue, America's street, down the central corridor for political power in this country. So she had, we speak of marketing genius, she knew she had that sense of place, and she had that sense of moment. She argued strenuously for the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, knowing she would get the inaugural spotlight, the press, and also all of the crowds. And of course, it was the crowds that attempted to ruin the event. There are a couple themes that historians talk about in terms of the parade, and really in terms of suffrage at this point, that I think are connections to our own time in terms of how the media look at women and civil rights issues for women. One is just the role of womanhood. What is a woman? What role does a woman have in the world? Does she have a role in the political sphere? It was really very much risky business for women, middle-class women, particularly privileged women, to march down Pennsylvania Avenue. This was not something privileged women did. Working-class women did this, and they were there too. But the privileged women were the ones that were really the unusual persons in that parade. And so there was that question of what role does womanhood have? And the second part of that historians of suffrage talk about today is the notion of citizenship. And this was very much on the minds, of course, of the organizers of the 1913 procession. What rights do women have as citizens? What rights should they have as citizens? Should they have the right to vote at that time? In our own time, should they have the right to all kinds of military positions, including combat positions? Should we have a woman president? Those are issues in our own time. For suffrage times, it was simply, do they have the right to the most fundamental right to consent, and that is the right to vote?
Well, as I recall, the argument against giving women the right to vote is that it would just be a lot of unnecessary counting, that women would vote like their husbands, and if they didn't vote like their husbands, they would cancel out the husband's vote. So what did it matter? And I guess single women had so little status in society that, you know, they weren't even considered. I'm going to vault to the end of the table because chronologically, Dr. Rosalind Terburg Penn, her book keeps us more in the past, then Erica will take us into the present. Dr. Terburg Penn has focused on African American women in the struggle, and there's been a lot written about that and a lot of controversy, whether black women were left out deliberately, whether they were a casualty of the times. You used the phrase that the suffragists had a fear of upsetting the racial politics of the South. That's a good opening for you, I think.
Thank you very much. Did you know black women became women suffragists very early in the movement? The first recorded black female suffragist, Sojourner Truth, spoke at a convention in 1850. By the Reconstruction years, more African American women, primarily among the educated elite, joined the movement. However, as the movement began to attract larger support in the 1890s, black women in the movement were not only discouraged from joining movement organizations with white women, they were also segregated in their attempts to demonstrate on behalf of the movement. An example of this was the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., which you must remember was a segregated city at the time. My focus today is on the parade and its impact among African American women suffragists. Organized by the two premier women's suffrage organizations, the NAWSA, National American Women's Suffrage Association, and the Congressional Union. The parade themes reflected roles of elite women. A New York Journal, a newspaper of the time, article, reported the event Splendor the day after the parade occurred, and I quote, "Lawyer Inez Milholland, clad in a white cape and riding a white horse, led the great women's suffrage parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in the nation's capital. Behind her stretched a long procession, including 9 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 3 heralds, more than 20 floats, and more than 5,000 marchers," unquote. What many people did not know was Milholland was an NAACP member, and her father, John Milholland, was treasurer of the NAACP at the time. Consequently, Inez reported women's suffrage news to the NAACP, whose The Crisis magazine published it. In the April 1913 edition of The Crisis, comment of the parade followed, and I quote, "In spite of the apparent reluctance of the local suffrage committee to encourage the colored women to participate, and in spite of the conflicting rumors that were circulated and which disheartened many of the colored women from taking part, they are to be congratulated that so many of them had the courage of their convictions and that they made such an admirable showing in the first great national parade. These disheartening experiences felt by African American women were exemplified by the leaders' recollections of the events. Ida B. Wells Barnett, president of one of the largest Black women's suffrage associations in the nation, Chicago's Alpha Suffrage Club, reported that NAWSA officials asked the Illinois women's suffrage delegation to, quote, keep their contingent white, unquote, and not march with the 65 Black Chicago delegation. Organizers feared offending the Southern white women who had pledged not to march in a racially integrated parade. They expected the Chicago Black delegation to march at the end of the procession with the other African American women's organizations. The militant Wells Barnett refused to comply. She's about my height, you know, she was bad. The Black Chicago delegation debated, then made the request public as they moved to the back of the procession. In the meantime, Wells Barnett and 2 white women delegates in the Illinois delegation had a plan. As Virginia Brooks and Belle Squire marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, Ida slipped from the crowd and joined them in the Illinois delegation procession, to the consternation of many. Yet other African American women's suffrage leaders did not take the militant approach and joined the procession at the end of the parade. But only after Inez Milholland complained to Alice Paul about her organizers who attempted to bar the Howard University women entirely. NAACP member Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, had recruited Howard University women from the newly organized Delta Sigma Theta sorority to march with her in the parade. They joined the other African American women's delegations relegated to the end of the procession. However, Terrell, unlike Wells Barnett, did not complain publicly. Later, she discussed her dismay over the events, directing her criticism towards Alice Paul and the Congressional Union. In correspondence with Walter White of the NAACP, I found Terrell questioned Alice Paul's alleged commitment to the enfranchisement of African American women and concluded, and I quote, "If she and others could get that Anthony Amendment through without enfranchising African American women, they would do so," unquote. To put my brief discussion in context, let me say, it does not matter if contemporary historians debate or deny whether white suffragists such as Alice Paul were racist or not. The point is, Black suffragists of the times believed that most were. And I'm finished.
Once again, driving home the point that perception is reality. I never heard that Inez Milholland was a member of the NAACP, so thank you for that. I read about her that she was known as the most beautiful suffragist ever, and I kind of think of her as the Gloria Steinem of her day, you know, that she kind of lifted the movement in terms of the visuals and again, the appeal to the media. Erica, you have Erica Falk, who's a former public radio reporter and anchor in addition to being at Aspen. You have examined 9 presidential campaigns, beginning presidential campaigns by women, going back to 1872, the first one, and on up to Hillary Clinton. I shudder to think to ask what the similarities are, but I'm sure you found them. So.
Yeah, so I've been asked to make a few comments on a more contemporary reading of what it means to have votes for women. In January of 2007, Senator Hillary Clinton declared her intention to seek the White House, and in doing so entered the race as a front-runner for the Democratic Party nomination. A December 2006 national poll by the Gallup organization reported that respondents named Senator Clinton most often as their choice for the Democratic nomination. Senator Barack Obama, who entered the race 4 days before Clinton, was named second. Despite the fact that Clinton was leading in the polls 33% to 20%, in the month in which both candidates announced that they would run for president, the top 6 circulating papers in the United States ran 59 stories that mentioned Obama in the headlines and just 36 that mentioned Clinton. That the press seemed biased against a woman running for president was not surprising. In fact, historical trends show that women candidates for president consistently receive less press coverage than equivalent men running in the same races. What was surprising was that the disparity was present when the woman was the front runner, and that such a problem, which had been manifest in press coverage since 1884, was still true in 2007. In my book, Women for President, Media Bias in 9 Campaigns, I examined the press coverage of 9 women who ran for president between 1872 and 2008. And I compared that coverage to the most equivalent man running in the same race. Now, when I embarked on the study, I expected to find 2 dramatically disparate coverage in the 1800s and 2 converging lines that showed equality in the aughts. The surprising conclusion of the book is that there were no trend lines. Most of the differences found in 1872 were still present in 2008. And this is all the more striking when you consider that in 1872, when the first woman ran, women did not have the federal franchise. No women were elected representatives. Women, with very few exceptions, were not reporters, editors, or newspaper owners. So let me give you a few quick examples of some of the other findings in the book. It turned out that when we aggregated all these races, men got about twice as much coverage as the equivalent woman running in the same race. So we're talking about 2 different candidates who polled about the same, and yet men got 2 articles for every one that a woman got, and those articles were 7% longer. When I examined the substance of the coverage, which is to say how much of the coverage was issue coverage or covered the public policy positions of the candidate, 16% of the paragraphs in the stories about women were such substantive issue coverage, while 27% of the paragraphs about men were. That means that men, on average, got 68% more issue paragraphs than women did. I also examined subtle ways the press might convey sexism. For example, the dropping of honorary titles. An example of this would be if the president referred to Senator Chase Smith and instead called her Mrs. Chase Smith. It turns out that the press does this for both men and women, but it happens to women 32% of the time and to men only 11% of the time. And just one final area I want to touch on is the idea of physical descriptions. So the press describes both men and women physically, for example, by saying that they're beautiful, or they wore a white cape, or that their hair was parted, or that they wore a black suit. But it happens 4 times as often for women as it does for men. And so there are a lot of parallels in the women's races across time, and there wasn't a lot of optimism. I will say on one positive note that though there were, all of these patterns were pretty much manifest in the Clinton-Obama race, the proportion of difference was smaller. So whether that's a reflection of the fact that Clinton was a front runner or, you know, we're moving, I can't tell you, but hopefully we're moving.
You only looked at presidential campaigns. Would it be fair to say that in races for Congress or school boards, or that in recent years, certainly, that being a woman can be an advantage?
Well, it's a really good question. There's been some really excellent studies that have looked at women in legislative races, House and Senate, and governor over the last 30 years. And they find basically the same patterns that I do. Now, I have to say that there's been some recent, very recent research coming out that suggests maybe in the last 5 years or so, again, it's possible that they're showing a diminishing of the differences. It's also true that the differences tend to be greater as you go up. So at the presidential level, they tend to be greater than at like the school board level.
And did you consider gender of the reporters? I know going back to 18, yes, you
So
did.
it's a great question, and I wanted to consider it. What's interesting is that in the early periods, there are no bylines. And so you can't code for gender of the reporter. So I'm sure there's some really interesting findings that other people have looked at. But because my research was historical, I wasn't able to include that.
Okay, all right, well, we're going to talk among ourselves here for a while, and then we are going to open this to questions. Jill, I wanted to go back to you. Before we came out here, you were chatting about Alice Paul and saying she was quite a controversial figure, that she wasn't likable, she was considered
They said she wasn't
authoritarian. Well, yes, but so what were her characteristics that created that impression, and do you think it was accurate?
One of the things that I'm going to try to do in my book is to look at Alice Paul with a fresh eye. I think that
your book is coming out.
Book is coming out hopefully by the end of the year, perhaps early next year. There are some flyers at the table where you came in, if you're interested, and I think you can pre-order from those. Going to try to take a fresh look at Alice Paul because I think she's a person who's been defined by her critics. If any of you looked at Stacy Schiff's recent biography of Cleopatra, she has an interesting line in her introduction. She says, one of the most dangerous intersections in history is the intersection of women and power. I think that Alice Paul was a very powerful personality. She annoyed people regularly. But I think that she, in descriptions of her, both in accounts at the time and in historians' accounts, she has been very much seen through a gendered lens. If the same person were there, going back to what you were saying, the same person were doing exactly what she was doing and was male, I suspect we would see that person in a much more positive light than many historians have seen Alice Paul. She was a tremendously focused individual once she decided on suffrage, and that took her a fairly long time. I think that's it's kind of a myth that she went to England and immediately jumped in with the Pankhurst. That's not true. But once she decided on suffrage and the Federal Amendment, she was very focused about it. She was a tremendously disciplined person. As many of you know here, I think she spent a great deal of time in prison in Britain and also here in America in November of 1917. And what enabled her to get through those experiences was her incredible self-discipline, which I think in part was honed by her Quaker background. You sit in those silent meetings for week after week after week, and as a child particularly, and you begin to develop some self-mastery. So her characteristics were very much that. She also was a very, very smart woman, and I think that's another thing that was kind of off-putting for a lot of people. I think I hope if we were going to cover her today, she might be seen in a much more positive light than many accounts of her have portrayed her.
And I would give a shout out to the HBO movie,
Yes.
Iron-Jawed Angel, where Hilary Swank plays Alice Paul.
Yes, although there are
Convincingly.
obviously some historical inaccuracies. We don't want to get into the bathtub scene there. Those of you that have known
It's
that, but
HBO.
It's HBO. Well, I like to say that we, in terms of the accuracy of that scene, we know that Alice Paul, or we suspect that Alice Paul bathed. But what she actually did in the bathtub is another story.
Okay.
One we don't know.
Okay. Rosalind, I would invite you to expand a little more on the racial dynamics. Frederick Douglass, he was very close to Susan B. Anthony, and this was very difficult, the decisions they made, political decisions, and I think it fostered a lot of repercussions that went well on into the 20th century. So give us a little perspective.
Well, the interesting thing is the African American women suffragists that I found who were active in the 1890s, before the turn of the century, liked Susan B. Anthony, whereas they did not like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It was something about her personality that turned them off, I guess. But they also thought Anthony was more sincere and that she would call it as she saw it. And although at times she would tell Douglas, for instance, she told Douglas once, don't come to the convention that was going to be in Atlanta because there'll be too many white Southern women there who will be offended if you come. And she said, I have to do this for expediency. So she was out front about the reasons and the things that she wanted to have done. And the club women, like Mary Church Terrell and others, understood that. And when she died, several of them went to her funeral to eulogize her. So it depends on the way you play the game, I think, and how honest you seem to appear. But we all know, we're not post-racial. Everybody said that after Obama was elected. Oh, we're post-racial now. We know that's not true. So a lot of what's going on then continues to go on. It just manifests itself in different ways. Unfortunately, our society has an institutionalized form of racism that's very difficult to overcome.
Okay, and I would ask you, the media, friend or foe of the suffragists? Yes.
Well, I didn't study coverage of the suffragists per se, but I do think it's a mistake to think of the media as some kind of conspiracy against women activists, whether they're suffragists or women candidates. The truth is that the media are part of the society, and the society has institutionalized sexism. And so I don't think it's some great conspiracy. It's just that the media are one of us, and they participate like us, and they're part of our culture. So they're both friend and foe.
Right, well, put it in the context specifically of the parade. And any one of you can answer that, the media coverage of the parade.
I didn't look at that much. I thought the New York newspaper was interesting. Again, I hadn't thought of it that way, the way they described the pomp and the circumstance. It wasn't negative, but it wasn't serious, I think. It was very descriptive. But I imagine a lot of people wanted to hear what happened, wanted to read what happened since they weren't there. So I found that to be an okay.
Well, I must say the Sewell Belmont House, and there was somebody here representing that, has a magnificent library. And when I did my book on the 19th Amendment, I spent a lot of time in their basement library reading firsthand accounts of the parade and many other things. And it was a spectacle like the country had really never seen before. And the Pennsylvania Avenue was lined on both sides, and the men primarily were throwing tomatoes and shouting epithets. And I think the headlines the next day were something like 11 people taken to the hospital, including Helen Keller, who was there and was supposed to appear that evening in Constitution Hall and was so disturbed by what was happening and that she was unable to do that. And the chief of police in the district, the police were on horseback, and they just kind of, I can't say stood aside since they're on horseback, so they sat aside on horseback. They didn't do anything to control the mayhem. And there were hearings later on Capitol Hill, and that district police chief lost his job. I mean, it played out a lot like modern events. And especially for the young people here, it's really thrilling to go back and read all of this contemporaneously, because it's like living history. And these are wonderful academics, and they bring it to life as well. But you can do it for yourself. It's all out there. And Susan B. Anthony had prodigious writings. Have any of you gone through her? No.
Well, let me go back to the media coverage of the parade, and I can maybe add a little bit to that. I think one of the interesting things about the parade was the very subversive nature of it. On the one hand, Alice Paul remembered the processions that she had participated in and even helped organize in Great Britain. And these were wonderfully colorful, beautiful, wondrous pageants, really. Graceful, dignified, beautiful. And this was the model for the 1913 procession. Right. So on the one hand, she was buying into very conventional, the very conventional tropes that the media was expecting of women. So you have coverage like miles of fluttering femininity in some of the coverage. You know, beauty, grace, and art bewilder the capital. Well, it was bewildering because on the one hand, we had all of these wonderful floats and costumes. There was a color scheme for the parade, you know, that was very carefully went from blue to purple to yellow, and all the flags and banners and the huge silk banners that Alice Paul's group plus all of the state band. It was just a gorgeous affair. So on the one hand, she was buying into this notion that women are beautiful and women do graceful things and women are dignified, so they're buying into that convention at the same time as they're saying, and women can walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and demand the vote.
Right.
So it was a very subversive parade politically, and you mentioned the hearings that came after. When they parlayed the outrage over what had happened in the police, with police not giving the women adequate protection, when they parlayed that into a congressional hearing, because there were congressmen marching in the parade with them, some of the suffrage, pro-suffrage congressmen. So when they managed to get a Senate hearing, then the publicity was then amplified, and all of the things that had happened in a parade were then repeated. And Alice Paul very carefully chose the women to very highly respectable, very prominent women, socially prominent women. No black women were in the hearings for very, very particular reasons, because they were not sending, and you mentioned the reputation angle before in terms of the presence of black women in the movement. That was very much on display or not on display during the hearing. So this gave the women the opportunity to press their point, while at the same time the press very much in favor of freedom of expression. So they tended to be kind of positive about this parade, because all the women were doing were walking down the street, minding their own business, trying to march down the street in favor of suffrage. They weren't doing anything to harm
minding their own
themselves.
business, but
Yes.
provoking the
Or
conventions
provoking,
of the day. And with that, I want to open the floor to questions. I think we have some one or two descendants of suffragists in the audience, and I would welcome them to come forward first. Okay.
One of those women is Colleen Jenkins, who's Elizabeth Cady Stanton's great-granddaughter.
Oh, yeah. Oh, good.
I'm the shortest descendant, so I guess I go first. I'm a descendant of Lucretia Mott. I'm here with my mother. So we're trying to figure out how many greats it is. I think I'm the great-great-great-granddaughter, if you're two greats, right? So that's on my mother's side. And then on my father's side, I was reminded just today that there was a suffragette who was a Russian Jew, and she chained herself to the White House fence. She was so petite, however, then when they unchained her and found she was a mere 100 pounds, she didn't go to jail because they all thought she was a child.
Okay.
So my contemporaries, I'm sorry, her name is Ethel Slavin Cohen on that side. So I have my counterparts here, and I'll let them introduce themselves. My mother, Patricia Ann McCarthy, as well. Sorry, I don't know where to go.
Thank you, my counterpart. I'm Elizabeth Jenkins Saline, and I'm the great-great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So we share the three greats, very exciting. I've never met a counterpart before, so thank you for bringing us together. And it is of matrilineal descent. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton had a daughter, Harriet, who had a daughter, Nora, who had a daughter, Rhoda, who had a daughter, Colleen, my mother, who had a daughter, Elizabeth. So thank you all for being here and for supporting our movement forward.
Okay. All right. Now, does anyone have a question? And, oh, here, Joan, yes. Here's another. Joan Michelson. Oh, you want me to the mic?
Thank you, Eleanor. I am a descendant as well, actually, on the reporter side. My great-great-aunt was Miriam Michelson, who Erica might have heard of, who was one of the foremost reporters of the suffrage movement, particularly in the 1890s, and personally, literally, kept the suffrage movement on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer and the San Francisco Chronicle. If I may, she also had a couple of interesting brothers, but we'll leave them out of it for the moment. I'd like to read a quote from Lynn Sherr's great book on Susan B. Anthony, which is a quote from Miriam. It's very brief. It must be a fine thing to believe, excuse me, I should give you context. She was writing about Susan B. Anthony herself and what it was like to interview Susan B. Anthony. It must be a fine thing to believe that you are leading in a great movement that will triumph and prove to the immense benefit of the world. To have the conviction that you are preaching a gospel that will save womankind and that nothing else can do it. We need to do that today, correct? And I actually have a question for the panel. The one thing that's been left out a little, except for maybe Frederick Douglass, is the role of men. If you could talk about, I mean, we need male champions. We love the men that are here. Thank you for being here. And if you could talk about some of the men who supported the women's movement and what they experienced outside of, both within the women's movement and outside of it as well, and how they, whether that affected the way they participated or not.
W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the editor of the Crisis magazine, a professor himself, a Harvard PhD, lived in New York City and was very, very active in promoting the movement. And he worked very hard to publicize the fact that men, black men in particular, could be the turning point if they supported suffrage. And in New York State, of course, black men could vote. And the referendum in New York that was posted in 1915 failed. Shortly after that, Du Bois got on the stick and said, you've got to get out here and vote. Now, I'm not saying that the black men turned the tide, but by 1917, the referendum had passed in New York State.
But you have a question over here, and then we'll go back to this side.
Yes, Faye Williams. First of all, while I was not in the March of 1913, I am a member of Delta Sigma Theta, so we are here.
Okay.
The second is I chair the National Congress of Black Women that brought truth to the Capitol, Sojourner Truth, 4 years ago. My question is, rarely do I see other groups support that whole thing about bringing Sojourner Truth to the Capitol. The National Women's History Museum is excluded. They were very helpful to us, but not very many others. My question is, why don't women writers and others who speak about women's suffrage talk about Sojourner Truth? I mean, I think she played a very important role, and I'm glad you mentioned it, Dr. Torberg Penn. But why is she left out? She was fighting both for getting rid of slavery as well as for women's rights. I mean, like always, black women have double duty, and she had double duty, but she often gets left out. Why?
Well, in recent years, she hasn't been. too scholarly, and maybe that's the problem. People like novels. They don't like scholarly stuff with footnotes and manuscripts and variety of things. But Nell Irving Painter came out with an award-winning biography of Sojourner Truth a few years ago. And Margaret Washington came out with another one about 2 years ago. Margaret teaches at Cornell. Nell was teaching, she's retired now, at Princeton. So I don't know. Maybe they're in ivory towers and people don't see them and read their works. But if you are interested, Nell Irving Painter and Margaret Washington, two authors who have recent biographies that are still in print of Sojourner Truth.
Thank you. Over here.
My name is Roberta Francis. I'm co-chair of the ERA Task Force for National Council of Women's Organizations, and also a real independent, if you will, scholar. I really am very much interested in how Douglass, Stanton, Anthony, Truth, all the 19th century folks worked together with all the prickliness that comes with being human, but worked together on abolition and women's rights and the advancement of a lot of social goals. I don't even know how to frame the question, but it seems to me that as much as there are fracture lines, we can learn some things about how they could put aside even the division, the schism over the 15th Amendment, and still remain in harness together. I'm so glad you cited the April 1913 Crisis magazine, Rosalind, because I read some of that thanks to Jill's Oneiser, and it's mind-blowing. One of the articles in that talked about how it was the white men who attacked the parade. The black men were very supportive of the suffragists. And this was a recounting written by some white women. I mean, it's just, when we look at how the superficial, oh, if it's race, it must be divided this way. If it's gender, it must be divided that way. Do you have like one rubric for how we right now could do better to be working together?
Okay. That's a
25 words.
big question.
Yeah, we want to have time to, there's two more questioners here, so who can do that?
I think conflict, as you suggest, Bobby, is just a feature of human nature, and there have been schisms in any organization that you could look at, and suffrage was not any different from that. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton did have their differences. They managed a relationship of 50 years, but they were mostly on the same path together. They didn't always agree with other suffragists at that time. There was a larger, well, actually, I shouldn't say a larger schism, a more profound schism between Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt and the Nausa group later, because the earlier schism really separated the movement for a generation. It didn't come together until almost the 20th century. So I think conflict is going to be a part of human nature, and we have to accept it. And I think it's often highlighted more with women than with men. Because the notion, as we see from television shows, of a catfight seems to draw a lot of attention. So I think it's gotten maybe more attention that it deserves. One thing we know about the schism between Alice Paul, the National Woman's Party, and NAWSA is that a lot of the differences were between the leaders. And the rank and file often belonged to both organizations, and they would pick and choose. If they thought picketing was too far down the radical road for them, they wouldn't do that, but they would participate in other Women's Party events. So I think it's been overblown to that extent. It was more between leaders than the rank and file at that time.
Okay.
I am another Alice. Alice Roosevelt Longworth has come to visit, and I just have a couple comments. Well, first of all, yes, of course. I was the first celebrity, so I'm not surprised to see all the press here. And, I've been following women's movements for most of my 96 years, and I'm just here to commend you for all the work you have been doing. Bella Abzug at one time asked me to do some fundraising. It's not really my thing, but I'm just so happy you all are doing it. No one is more dedicated to individual empowerment than I am. Just a couple comments. You showed Liz Carpenter talking about my cousin Eleanor. Always Eleanor, always Eleanor. You know, J. Edgar Hoover had 3,000 pages on Eleanor. You know, I just didn't think she was that interesting. But, you know, surprises may happen. Maybe one day there'll even be a memorial to her, even though we should pay more attention to Father's Memorial. Anyway, just another comment that, you know, I tease Eleanor, but I did admire her. You know, people said, she would say, a woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong she is until she gets into hot water. And lastly, I just want to thank everybody for commenting on my hat. You know, Lyndon Johnson said he couldn't kiss me under this hat. I told him that's why I wear it.
We should say that there is now a biography of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, simply called Alice. It's not the 4-volume, or maybe, I don't know if it may be 5-volume now, of Eleanor Roosevelt, but it's out there. I don't recall the author, but it's just a couple years old.
Didn't she have a famous pillow with needlepoint on it that said, if you have, oh, here it is, okay. You can't say something nice, come sit by me. Right, okay. Okay. All right, our final questioner looks right out of the period we're discussing.
Thank you. I reenact suffragist Mrs. Robert Walker, and I also want to thank all of you for being here tonight, because if it weren't for us, our daughters would not know about all that has gone before us. And there's also a wonderful group of folks here tonight that I want to acknowledge. I'm part of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Committee. Would all of you please stand up? They were the ones that were holding the banners and greeting you all. And one of the things that we and they are about is making sure our daughters don't forget what had to happen to have that 19th Amendment passed. So with that in mind, and this goes for any of you lovely ladies up there, name 1 or 2 things we must do to make sure our daughters and our sons don't forget.
Pass the ERA.
Women need to run for office.
I can't think of one. There are lots of things.
Well, yeah, rights that have been so hard fought and won can be taken away, and so we need to remind ourselves of the hard road that our foremothers walked for us. So thank you all for being here tonight.
Excuse me. Excuse me. She didn't acknowledge me. I'm so sorry. You just.
We finished our
Everybody was
question.
looking in that direction. I understand.
Oh, okay.
I just had a really, really quick question because
Sure.
I was concerned about the response with regards to Sojourner Truth, and I was just curious if maybe someone else had a comment. Could it have been she did not get the exposure because she was not an aristocrat? She's a former slave. She was not an elitist woman. She did not look the role. You know, could that have played a part in it? Why even to today she does not get the kind of exposure that perhaps should. I mean, obviously she warrants. Did anyone else have a comment on that?
In the schools, Sojourner Truth gets a lot of exposure. And I think any student coming through elementary school knows who knows who Sojourner Truth is at this stage.
No, I was really talking with regards, I understand that, that's absolutely true. I meant with regards to the suffrage movement and in the historical documents and that sort of thing.
Many schools have these students reenact, I am a woman, am I a woman, or I am a woman speech? Ain't I a woman speech? Yeah. And so that, I mean, I think that was all tied in with women's suffrage. So you know, not to say that she doesn't deserve more, but she certainly has been getting the recognition in elementary and middle schools. There's a lot of competitions even for students to do those speeches. Yeah, much more so than Alice Paul, correct.
Let me make a statement about it. Sojourner Truth was an illiterate woman. Many people spoke for her and lied. Nell Painter talks about that in detail in her biography. And I can see how that would be controversial, because people would say, she didn't say that. I mean, things would be in the newspaper, contradictory things. So-and-so said such and such, but we don't know that that's true. And I'm not going to go into the details, because I do know one that I'm not going to tell you now, because then you'll be upset. But Truth was sort of a camp follower. She would go to various activities and work her way. She would do household work to pay for her food and her board. She had no problem being a working class former slave who was freed, because she was from New York State, and when they abolished slavery, she managed to gain her freedom. She did a lot of things with no pretense. She was out there, and I'm proud of the fact that she was. But lots of stories have creeped up about her that are not true, and she might not have even known about them because she couldn't read the newspaper. She had to rely on other people to say things. When I saw the movie Lincoln, I said to myself, I wonder if they're going to show her coming to see Lincoln, which she did. She had a photograph that she used to sell to people. I've seen images of it with her talking to Lincoln. But, you know, that wasn't going to come out in the movie, was it? No, because it really wasn't right. But, so there are things that have happened that you don't know about, things that have happened that you think happened that didn't. So, but we're learning more about her, and I think that's important.
Very difficult to do, and the fact that Nell Irvin Painter did what she did with Sojourner Truth, I mean, that's really the point of the biography, as you're suggesting, is how difficult it was to find out who Sojourner Truth was. So anytime you have a subject like that who does not leave records, the kind of records that scholars like, it's going to make it more difficult for a biography or, you know, extensive kind of scholarly work to be done. I think that has hindered her visibility too.
This is a fascinating discussion, and fortunately we have a reception after just a couple more remarks, so we can certainly continue that over there. As Maureen Bunyan makes her way up here, I'd like us to offer a hand to our wonderful panel. And thank you, Maureen, for joining us. We appreciate you making it here, especially on a tight schedule. I think Maureen is someone who needs few introductions, but just very briefly, she is, of course, a co-anchor here in Washington locally for ABC 7 WJLA TV, and she is a founder of the Association of Black Journalists. Maureen.
Thank you, Angela. I won't take too much time, and I wanted to say that I'm very sorry I didn't get to introduce Eleanor, because that was my formal job here. And before I go, I do want to say that Eleanor and I worked closely for 20 years on the International Women's Media Foundation, and I think I could speak for her in saying that our experience together, along with many other women journalists in Washington and across the world, was very positive, very creative, and we're very proud of that organization. Eleanor, like so many women journalists, has learned that her voice is of great value. And one of the reasons that we honor her and so many women, not only in the suffrage movement, but also women journalists, is because we as women in this past century at least really were able to achieve the goal of having our voices heard. And that was, I don't mean to put that in the passive voice. We did it. It wasn't done to us. We were not allowed to speak. We spoke, and that's why we're all here today. And I do want to just say one thing. Both Liz and Erica mentioned something that I was going to say in very brief remarks, and that is the importance of the democratic process. And in this country, it means the importance of the vote, and it's the importance of bringing people to elected office. And the women's vote, quote unquote, has been absolutely instrumental in the last few elections. It certainly has been instrumental in the one we just had. And as a journalist, watching women in Congress and the impact of women in public service on public policy, I don't see anything more powerful than that taking place in our country today. I was very fortunate as a young journalist coming to Washington to have been able to meet the women who were forces in Congress, Bella Abzug and Barbara Jordan and Pat Schroeder and Patsy Mink and Shirley Chisholm. And I know the impact that they had on my life personally, especially in the workplace. I know the impact they've had on our country in terms of legislation to protect the environment, health care, equal pay, sexual harassment, child care, and of course the ERA. And I think that we have to remember that one way in which our voices have now been institutionalized is through the women that we elect. And they would not have been elected if we had not passed the suffrage vote. And so we today are the recipients and the inheritors of so much of this wonderful history. Let us not take it for granted. As a journalist, I do not take it for granted, and I'm very, very happy that at least here in Washington, I've been able to see the impact of the work of the fine women that you're celebrating here today. And I thank you all for doing this, especially the Women's History Museum and the National Press Club. And Angela is a great example of the next generation of women who are carrying on the banner, and I hope that she is able to do so with great freedom and great, great support from all of us. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Maureen. We are honored to have two last guests with us tonight to give closing remarks. The first of those is Reverend Gwendolyn E. Boyd, who is the past national president of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and that is the group who is putting on the March reenactment that I'm sure she will invite you to on Sunday.
Good evening to all of you, and we're certainly excited to be a part of this launch party this weekend. I do bring you greetings from the current national president of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Cynthia Butler McIntyre, who will be joining all of us this weekend as we celebrate this tremendous occasion. I was asked to share just a little bit of information about Delta Sigma Theta so that all of us can operate on the same level playing field. And Ife has already stolen my thunder. And I'm glad she did. She's a dynamic member of our organization. But Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated was founded on January 13th, 1913 on the campus of Howard University by 22 undergraduate students who believed in social activism and who believed in moving an agenda forward for equality. Now, while they were students at Howard University, they heard about the suffrage march from Mary Church Terrell and many others who were a part of the community community and the campus community at that time. They were intrigued by this and wanted to be able to participate. And so, of course, they signed up and made sure that the organization was registered as one of the groups in the original suffrage march. And to our knowledge, it was the only African-American group that was part of the original suffrage march. And so our 22 young founders who were college students, and you have to transport your mind back to 1913, they could not leave campus without a chaperone, because they were not allowed to do that. And so they had to get a chaperone who happened to be a gentleman professor, Professor Gregory at Howard University, who accompanied them down to the march. And our founders did participate and walk in the original suffrage march. And we are excited that from that nucleus of 22 social activists, Delta Sigma Theta has initiated over 300,000 women over the last 100 years who continue their legacy of being advocates for women's rights and who continue to be those social activists in our community. The other thing I want us to, again, transport ourselves back to 1913, and it's been a part of this conversation this evening, is that they, as a part of the suffrage march, were marching for women to have the right to vote even before African Americans could have the right to vote. But they were women who were visionary and had tremendous foresight and knew that one day all of this would come about. And so we are excited as we, the members of Delta Sigma Theta, are celebrating our centennial year. We began the year with a float in the Tournament of Roses parade, and we had our tremendous Founders Day celebration right here in Washington, D.C. about 3 weeks ago, where we had about 16,000 of our members come to celebrate our founding at Howard University. And we will continue our celebration throughout the year. But as we celebrate our centennial, two of our members, their names have already been called tonight, Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, were both members of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And many other names that we could call, Dr. Dorothy Irene Height, who was our 10th national president, and so many others who have been a part of moving the agenda forward for the rights of women. And so we are excited to be able to retrace the footsteps of our founders and all of the women who marched back in 1913 to make sure that women had the right to vote. And yes, we've come a long way, and all of the accomplishments that have been attributed to women over the last 100 years, but all of us in this room know we still have a long way to go because we acknowledge the fact that we're celebrating and launching the Centennial Weekend right now, but just yesterday, with the unveiling of the statue of Rosa Parks, right across the street was also testimony at the Supreme Court for Shelby County versus Holder. And so, yes, we still have a long way to go, but it doesn't negate the fact that we are here to celebrate. Many of you have already signed up. Your organizations have signed up to be a part of the reenactment on Sunday. The press is going to be all over this. I was a little bit delayed here because we've been making the rounds in all of the press packets and letting people know what is happening on Sunday, who will be there, and we hope that all of you will be there. We will have the opening rally at 9 a.m. on the west of the U.S. Capitol, and we will step out at 9:30 as we retrace the footsteps of our founders and reenact the suffrage march, and we look forward to seeing all of you there.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. And last but most certainly not least, we have Joan Wages, who is the president and CEO of the National Women's History Museum, our partner here tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Angela. Thank you to the National Press Club for partnering with us on this extraordinary event. There have been comments by the panel and from the audience about how are we going to ensure that those in the future know about what the women have gone through in the past. And our answer to that is we must have a National Women's History Museum. This celebration is just made to order for us. This is what we are all about. This is why we exist, is to honor what the women have gone through and face the challenges before us, and most importantly, how they have overcome those challenges. We have a quick public service announcement that we would love to show you.
Don't tell me I can't say what I want. Don't tell me I can't be a soldier. Don't tell me I can't be an inventor. Don't tell me I can't be a movie star. I am Rosa Parks. I am Anna Mae Wong. I refuse to give up my bus seat to a white person. I disguised myself as a man to fight in the Revolutionary War. Don't tell me I can't fly. I am Amelia Earhart. I was shot twice in my first battle and removed the bullets myself.
Don't let them be forgotten.
Support National Women's History Museum.
Another reason we need the National Women's History Museum. So in the midst of this celebration, we are delighted to report that the museum is moving forward. Just yesterday, legislation was introduced in the House and the Senate that would have a commission created by Congress that would identify a permanent home for the museum. We are hoping on or next to the National Mall. And also yesterday, we released polling results that showed that more than 2/3 of the American public support Congress authorizing us to have a site, a building site on the National Mall. So there are a couple of people we would love to thank. Jan Duplain, the subtle Jan Duplain, who has been running around all evening. Ann Stone and Becky Shergans, who have worked so hard on this event tonight. We hope that you'll take a few minutes to see the exhibit out in the foyer that the museum staff has been working on. Sydney Winston has done the videos that you have seen this evening, and Liz Maurer has helped with the putting together the exhibit. And there's a group, believe it or not, who we think has not been recognized, and that is Unite Women. Would all of you stand, please? They have come from across the country. They have been supporting and working to get the word out about this celebration. Linda Denny, the museum board member who's been coordinating with them, and they have all been working with the Sewell Belmont House, AAUW, Turning Point, and other coalition members. So we are so grateful to all of you for helping us. This Saturday at 11 o'clock at the Lisner Auditorium, GW campus, there's going to be another scholars panel, and this time it's going to focus more on the background of the suffrage movement and about the 1913 March. So it's open to the public, and we invite all of you to come. And of course, we look forward to joining with you in the march on Sunday morning. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Joan. I would like to thank all of our speakers here tonight, as well as the National Press Club staff who helped put together the event that we've all enjoyed this evening. Thank you to the reenactors and everybody who helped bring to life the events that happened 100 years ago. Thank you especially to our audience. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate your questions. And before we depart for the evening, I would like to invite you to enjoy some refreshments prepared by Susan Delbert, who is standing in the back. apropos to what we're talking about this evening, Susan is the National Press Club's first female executive chef. And if you like what you have here tonight and you'd like to come back to our Fourth Estate restaurant, which is open to the public, and try out our full menu, there are coupons for tonight's attendees on the table out in the hallway. With that, we are adjourned. Please enjoy.
And merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. In the early 1890s, Carrie Chapman Catt led the organization in helping Western women win the vote, and the Wyoming Territory became the first to grant full civil rights to women on December 10, 1869. This state strategy was amplified in 1916 by revived attention to an amendment to the Constitution, which would make woman suffrage a federal right. Led by Maud Wood Park and the National American Woman Suffrage Association's office in D.C., the movement generated a radical new party called the National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. The party vigorously picketed the White House in 1917, demanding the enactment of the constitutional amendment. Both the House and the Senate voted to approve the 19th Amendment by the necessary two-thirds majority in 1919. Tennessee was the last state to approve the amendment by one vote, and the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution on August 26, 1920. After more than 7 decades of labor, American women won the vote in every part of the United States.
Here at the National Press Club, while it's no longer remarkable for a woman to be standing here as the National Press Club president, there was a time not so long ago that it was almost unimaginable. You can learn more about the history about women at the National Press Club in the display that's in the lobby. It went up today and it'll be here for March for Women's History Month. Today we have women leaders across the landscape in journalism, from anchors like Diane Sawyer to New York Times executive editor Jill Abramson to the Gannett CEO Gracia Martori. At my Bloomberg bureau, we have Cheska Antonelli as our first female Washington bureau chief. At the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, there are 20 women senators, the most of that chamber has ever included. In these ways, we have arrived, but the future is still before us. Most of these people are the first woman to hold their position. The Women's Media Center, in a report issued last week, found that male front-page bylines at the top U.S. newspapers outnumbered female bylines in coverage of the 2012 presidential election by a margin of nearly 3-to-1. Men were also far more likely to be quoted than women in newspapers, television, and on public radio. On Sunday talk shows, women comprise only 14% of those interviewed and 29% of roundtable guests. Here at the National Press Club, I'm the 106th president overall and the 11th woman. But in good news, I took the reins from another woman, Teresa Warner, who was president last year, and including the two of us, 6 of the past 11 presidents, so more than 50%, have been women. So we're making up for lost time here. Some of our club member predecessors, including some women who are here with us tonight, fought long and hard for women to gain admittance to the National Press Club, which they finally did get in 1971. Let's listen now to the words of one of those first female members, Liz Carpenter.
It was a great thrill. Our foremothers' battle for the vote began in 1848. In the earliest stages of the movement, many women, disheartened and outraged by the practice of slavery, had joined the effort to abolish it. But like outspoken abolitionists Sarah and Angelina Grimke, these women became disillusioned when they discovered that they were barred from leadership positions in American political culture because of their gender. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, 2 linchpins in the development of the movement, attended the 1840 Anti-Slavery Convention in London, and Mott and 5 other official delegates were refused seats on the basis of their gender. Stanton and Mott decided to hold their own convention 8 years later in Seneca Falls, New York. The convention marked the first public proclamation of American women's demand for the right to vote. The Declaration of Sentiments, as it was called, also endorsed a variety of other changes. It was signed by 68 women and 32 men. Between 1848 and 1869, about 20 other women's rights conventions were held in the United States, which became the basis for the suffrage movement in the 1870s and 80s. After the end of the Civil War in 1865, a rift developed within the movement over the 15th Amendment, which granted the vote to African American men, but made no reference to women. The National Woman Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, opposed black male suffrage without suffrage for women, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe, supported the enfranchisement of African American men as a first step towards the enfranchisement of women. Although the next 20 years proved divisive for the two organizations, in 1890 they reconciled.
For me, the first time I went to Washington, which some people had irreverently called the only asylum in the world run by its own inmates, and I found that to be pretty true lots of times, but I was thrilled to be there. I was 22 years old, fresh out of the University of Texas with my journalism degree in hand, and I took the 12th floor where all the important newspapers were housed and started knocking on doors and finding that the New York Herald Tribune with Bert Andrews, the Christian Science Monitor with Roscoe Drummond, all of these were the papers we'd been studying in history of journalism back in Texas. That led up to my seeing, for the first time, the National Press Club. And I'd never seen a real club before. I was out of Texas in a small town, and I remember those paneled walls, dark brown, and 3 tickers, INS, AP, and UP, going off all the time. The click of them, if you're a reporter, that gets in your blood fast, and it never leaves. Eleanor Roosevelt was the mentor of all newswomen, and for good reason, because she started the first press conferences that a First Lady ever held. And incidentally, Lady Bird Johnson was the first Lady to have a journalism degree. And so she knew the 5 W's and the H, and she knew, made my job as her press secretary much later easy. But Eleanor was interested in social issues.
I'm Angela Greiling Keane. I'm this year's National Press Club president, and I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News. We are excited to have such a full room tonight and such a great program up ahead of us. Tonight we're going to celebrate the centennial of the suffragists marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, very, very near to here. Because we're here at the National Press Club, we will also talk about the role that the press played in helping women get the right to vote, especially through the coverage of that march 100 years ago this weekend. We're going to see a video produced by the National Women's History Museum of some of the women who worked more than a century ago to get women the right to vote. It was a long effort, as I think most of us in this room know. But to kick things off before that, I'm going to propose a toast. Hopefully you all got a glass on the way in. I'd like to propose a toast to the courageous women suffragists who put themselves on the line to gain something that most of us today take for granted. Please raise your glasses to them.
The foundation of our democracy is rooted in the right of all of its citizens to express their opinions and influence government through their vote. Today, Americans are bonded by our ability to vote. But for many groups, the fight to secure full citizenship has been a long and arduous one. American women's fight for suffrage was the making of over 70 years of hard work, dedication, organization, failures, and ultimate success. It culminated in the passage of the 19th Amendment that enfranchised women on August 26, 1920.